All right, welcome. Today we're going to dive into the really remarkable story of a man's search for faith. It's a journey that started in a seminary for the Catholic priesthood, and, well, it ended in a place he never, ever expected. This is a story about big questions, deep conviction, and what happens when your love for your faith is so strong that it actually leads you to question its very foundations. So let's just jump right into the heart of it with this quote. This one sentence just captures the entire paradox of Eusaphios' journey, doesn't it? It wasn't a rejection of Jesus that set him on this path. It was actually a profound love that made him want to understand more deeply. And that understanding ultimately led him to a conclusion that would change his entire life. So you have to wonder, right? How does someone so deeply embedded in Christianity even begin a journey like this? Let's go all the way back to the beginning, to a life that was just steeped in religious tradition. Eusaphios was literally born into faith. His father's family were practicing Protestants who even founded churches. And on the other side, his mother's family was devoutly Catholic. So, surrounded by all this deep religious tradition, he found himself leaning towards Catholicism. And we're not talking about a casual faith here. This was his entire world. Now, his path to the priesthood wasn't just some simple career choice. When he was in his early teens, he got hit hard by what he calls a dark reality. All the crime and drugs happening in a city. And that experience, it pushed him to the complete opposite extreme. He developed this really negative view of the world and just threw himself into an intense kind of religiosity. He wanted to completely detach to prepare for the hereafter. So first he thought about becoming a monk, and that eventually led him to formally studying for the priesthood, which he did for 2.5 years. So there he is, entering the seminary to make his faith even stronger, to dedicate his whole life to it. But, kind of ironically, it was the academic part of his studies, the very thing meant to strengthen his belief, that started to create the first cracks in that foundation. See, the curriculum to become a priest isn't just about theology. You have to do these deep dives into philosophy and even other world religions. And for Eusaphios, being exposed to all these different ideas, these different ways of thinking, well, that was the catalyst. It forced him to ask questions he had never even thought to consider before. And this is where that internal struggle really becomes clear. He's looking at these core doctrines he's always known, but these powerful new questions keep popping up. For example, he thought, if all the earlier prophets worked so hard to teach the absolute oneness of God, why did the story end with God becoming a human being? And if faith is supposed to be a guide for life, why is detaching from family seen as a better, more holy path? But maybe the biggest one was this. He started to wonder why the story of Jesus seemed to require faith alone, while the life of Prophet Muhammad was backed up by so much verifiable historical data. You see, these questions weren't just academic exercises for him. They were deeply, deeply personal. And this just confirms it. His motivation wasn't about trying to disprove anything. He was on a quest driven by love, to find the truth, to figure out who Jesus was in reality, beyond all the layers of theology and tradition. So this intense period of questioning really left him in a crisis. He looked into Buddhism, other forms of Christianity, but nothing felt right. And that's when a new path, one he had never ever considered, started to open up. His introduction to Islam wasn't from a book or some lecture, it was personal. It was his own cousin, who had some connections with the Muslim community, who first started asking him the hard questions. He'd say, "What about these millions of Muslims? Are you really saying they're all going to hell?" And that wasn't just a theological debate, it was a human one. And it's what led him into the circle of Muslims for the very first time. So he decides to take a step, but it's a very cautious one. He takes what he calls a half shahada. That's the declaration of faith. He could completely get behind the first part. There is no God but God. That just resonated with him, It sounded just like the first of the 10 commandments he'd known his entire life. He was totally convinced, intellectually, of God's absolute oneness. As for the rest of it, he figured he'd worry about that later. But later came with a massive hurdle. You see, the second part of the Shahada is accepting Muhammad as the messenger of God. And for someone raised in his tradition, that idea was terrifying. He was taught that anyone who came after Jesus claiming to be a prophet was a false prophet, basically an antichrist. He had to confront this fear head on. So what changed his mind? Well, as he studied the life of the Prophet Muhammad, a few things really stood out. It wasn't just about battles. It was his compassion, his leadership, and his incredible ability to establish a whole society built on faith and justice. But the really crucial point for him was the evidence. Unlike what he felt he was being asked to believe about Jesus, here was a life with documented, verifiable history. It wasn't about faith without evidence. It was faith that was supported by it.
And there's another really interesting layer to this. He directly takes on that common idea that Islam was spread by force. And from his perspective as someone with a Latin American background, he felt that Christianity was the religion that was forced upon his ancestors by the sword. So that personal historical context made the idea of freely choosing Islam even more powerful for him.
But look, a decision like this is never just an intellectual exercise. It comes with huge personal consequences. And for Yusuf, this choice would put his closest, most important relationships to the ultimate test. The reaction from his mother was immediate, and it was painful. She pretty much rejected him. For her, the issue was black and white. If you don't accept that Jesus is God, there's a problem. In her mind, he hadn't just abandoned his faith. In a way, he'd abandoned his Puerto Rican culture, which for her was completely tied to Catholicism. But then, in this really surprising twist, his devoutly Catholic grandmother, a woman who was a leader in her own church, had a totally different reaction. When she saw his wife wearing the hijab, she didn't see something foreign or wrong. Instead, she just said, "That's the right way." She saw a reflection of the modesty and piety she valued in her own faith. Thankfully, the story with his mother did eventually get better. But it wasn't easy. He says he really had to fight for his children to have a relationship with their grandmother. But over time, the birth of his kids helped to heal that rift and just got them talking again. And in the middle of all this, while he felt he was being torn from his family, he found a new one. The Ummah, which is the global Muslim community, became his refuge. It was this incredible sense of collective belonging, all bound together by a shared faith, that really supported him when he felt the most alone.
So, after this long, difficult, and really profound journey, what was it about Islam that finally gave him the clarity he'd been searching for all that time?
At the end of the day, what he found was this message of profound clarity. It was a faith built on the simple, direct worship of one God, and it was supported by texts that he found to be authentic. It offered practical guidance for every single aspect of life, not just some detached spirituality. And it presented this universal message for all of humanity, with a really hopeful view that every person is born good. And this really brings us full circle, doesn't it? For Imam Yusuf Rios, his journey didn't end with him rejecting Jesus. In his mind, it ended in the fulfillment of what he saw as Jesus' core mission. He believes Jesus taught the oneness of God, love and compassion, and for him, he found the clearest, most direct expression of those teachings in Islam. We'll end with his direct message to those outside the faith. And it's not a command, it's really an invitation to explore. He encourages people to just encounter the Quran and the life of the Prophet Muhammad for themselves. And that's a powerful final thought, from a man whose own encounter with these very sources changed everything. It kind of leaves us with a question, doesn't it? What happens when we truly follow our questions, wherever they might lead?